Hey, this is John Lee Dumas, the founder and host of Entrepreneurs on Fire. And if you're wanting to learn how to embrace change and navigate through disruption as a leader, then listen to the Leadership is Changing podcast with my good friend, Denis Gianoutsos. He's prepared to ignite.
Welcome to Leadership is Changing. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change. This is taking your leadership to another level by finding the balance between executive excellence and personal well-being through stories that inspire real change. It's time to adapt in our fast-moving world when leadership is changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos.
There's always that saying out there, I think it's culture eats strategy alive. I think that's the right way of saying it, or how it's said. What do they mean by that, and what are you seeing out there in the market today?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question. So if we think about the things that have evolved over the last few years, we know that there are organizations out there that are performing quite well. So in other words, they're delivering on their strategy. So they have very good sales, they have very good revenue, they have very good profitability. And some organizations aren't performing that well or having difficulty attracting talent or retaining talent. And what we're seeing is that more and more, either people inside organizations or people who are exploring joining an organization, it's not just about the job, it's not just about the pay, but more and more people want to join a culture that has some very specific characteristics where they will be more likely to succeed as opposed to a culture that's maybe not as positive or as supportive or as tolerant of errors, as an example of cultures that people may not be attracted to.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here, Alex, is that the culture is really important. So I think it's really important. And so when you say that, Alex, about the culture side of things, I think it's really important because a lot of people do join organizations, but they leave people. And if the culture isn't right, how does an organization, A, know it's not right, and B, how do they fix it?
Two great questions. On the first question, I think, and it's interesting, I was having this conversation just a little while ago, and I was saying there's an organization that I was working with where they have a very innovative culture, right? So their culture is quite good in innovation and developing cutting edge things. And yet, if we looked at, so that was a very positive culture, right? Able to innovate, able to deliver, some very nice product. But then if we looked at the people side of the culture, then the people side of the culture wasn't really following suit. So in fact, there could be parts of a culture that are really positive and then other parts of the culture that need to be worked on. So I think it's really important that leaders in an organization really take a cold, hard look at current state of affairs, because I think sometimes because they're focused so much on one part of the culture that's good and positive and working well, we can easily imagine that, oh, the whole culture is good. And in fact, that's usually not the case. So usually there'll be parts of the culture that will be strong and then other parts of the culture that need to be worked on. If we talk about what can help them do, first of all, is taking a really, really cold, hard look at both the subjective parts of the culture and the objective data. So for example, cultural surveys or cultural diagnostics or engagement scores or things like that can give us a good indication. But I think actually having conversations with people that are in the culture and maybe people who have left the organization as well. So to not be reticent to talk to people who have left the organization and talk about, were there any characteristics of the culture that led them to move on. And I think it's important at that point, once this cold, hard look has been taken, to really then say, okay, how do we help evolve our culture? Because maybe the culture was good for many years, but with everything that's changing in the environment and in the context and in a whole bunch of industries, it's always important to say, how do we continue to evolve our culture so that it's actually going to help us to get where we want to go as opposed to being a hindrance, and that we can attract and retain people so that culture can be that differentiator where people want to join us, not because of what we sell or what we make or what services we provide, but really to be part of a culture that's positive and is allowing people to be themselves. So I want to talk a little bit more about that aspect of cultures now that are becoming more prized.
It's interesting how you talk about the cold, hard look. I think it's the cold, hard look at themselves and they need to look in the mirror. However, Alex, I see sometimes that a lot of organizations tend to put their head in the sand and they want to do a tick in the box type scenario. Oh, yeah, we looked at our culture, but are they willing to do something about it? Because one is to actually get the feedback, two is actually to acknowledge it, but three, which is really important, is to do something about it. Are you seeing a lot of organizations who are just paying lip service to it? And are you seeing those who are actually very serious about it and actually doing something about it? And what kind of results are they getting?
I think if organizations are really committed to the first part, right, really taking a cold, hard look at the culture, the current state of the culture, they tend to be more open to the feedback that's generated, right? And to the feedback that's shared. So usually those two will go hand in hand, right? If we're willing to take a cold, hard look, we're more likely then to be open to, to the data of where we are culturally. What tends to be a challenge is how do we make things better or how do we evolve the culture? It's not necessarily about the culture being better. It's about being more adapted to where the organization is. And I think I'll give an example in terms of leadership development. And I think a lot of organizations over the past many years have really said, hey, how do we develop our leaders? How do we develop programs to help them become more strategic thinkers, to help them become better managers, to help them do business planning, to help them drive results, to help them take on accountability? And that's great, right? And that's really great and really important. And they tend to stop there. But culture tends to live or not live. It tends to live in terms of how people interact with each other, right? The interpersonal dynamic that happen inside an organization. So those are things like emotional intelligence, right? Empathy, compassion, vulnerability, being open to diversity, psychological safety, so people can be themselves, are not just allowed to be themselves, are actually supported in being themselves and sharing who they are and sharing their knowledge and sharing their experiences. And along with psychological safety, something we don't talk about a lot, and it's a concept that I've been thinking about very recently, that's psychological security. So we could say, yeah, we're psychologically safe and we want people to be themselves and we want people to talk about who they are. But if something happens where a group or a person or a team is not allowed to do that, do we have a security mechanism, so psychological security, to intervene and do something when the safety isn't there? So in other words, can somebody raise the flag and say, hey, thought this was a psychologically safe culture. I actually don't feel comfortable in either sharing something I'm seeing or not allowed to be myself. And then do we have a mechanism for security, for intervention to do something to bring things back? That's where many organizational cultures tend to not go to that interpersonal dynamic, tend not to create a holistic, psychologically safe environment. And if the safety in the environment is not upheld, there's no security mechanism to intervene. So that's something more and more that people inside organizations and people outside that are thinking about joining the organization are very attuned to.
Sure. I've got 30 years in training development. I've trained in 6 different countries, 10,000 people, but I also have a sales background. So my sales led into training and development. And where I come to today with what I teach just came from a fascination with the way people communicate. I always was fascinated by people saying, how are you? And then never really paying attention to the answer. It was almost like just non-conversation. So that led me into conditioning and neuro-linguistic programming and everything that surrounds that.
So it's interesting how you say that because I think for my audience here who are executives, leaders, aspiring leaders, and so forth, when they're meeting people, like when they're in a networking event, first of all, some people just don't like going to networking events. And I think they feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I think what you just said there is really important about when we meet each other. Remembering names is one thing, but how are you and things like that. How is important is it for someone to actually listen to what the other person says? What should they be doing?
I think communication should be intentional, especially if you're a leader speaking to other leaders, or you're working with investors, or maybe you're just selling your idea, your concept to somebody else. But speech needs to be intentional. And how are you is really not as intentional. Something more intentional would be, it's a true pleasure to meet you. I was looking forward to this. And at the end of the pause, that really gets somebody else to respond. But I was really looking forward to meeting you is a much more emphatic greeting or enthusiastic greeting that's likely to lead to a reciprocation. The hi, how are you? We're all so conditioned to just do the fine, thanks, or I'm okay, how are you? Just skip that step. And for companies that have sales organizations, please have your salespeople skip that step. It's a non-starter.
Yeah. And I think really good because it's different, right? It's a different way. So it'll actually grab people's attention. Or it's a bit like, how are you? And the response from somebody is, I am fantastic, or
Right.
I'm awesome. And I used to have somebody who used to work for me who used to respond like that. And it would actually create the conversation because people go, whoa, this is different. And it's because people don't normally respond like, I'm good, good. Yeah, good, thanks. And it's just a non sort of kind of response, just a sort of average thing, right? Where it's different. And I like what you're saying. Asking that question is different for sure.
It breaks the conditioning. Dennis, we're conditioned from the time we're young to respond certain ways to certain things. Stove is hot, lion is dangerous, razors are sharp. And it gets to be that way with some of our verbiage. And if we can break that conditioning, it not only helps to reset a conversation, but it helps to make both of you think. Because when we're not used to a greeting or response, it's almost like a little reset in our head that takes place. And usually to your benefit if your greeting is strong enough.
Yeah, very good. Good to hear. Now, your background as well is regarded as a fractional chief learning officer. What is that?
It's kind of a fancy way of saying that I come in and I work with a company to develop their training and development. So I help them create onboarding programs. I help them get their salespeople up and profitable. You spend 20,000 and up to bring somebody on board, and it can take 6 months to a year before they're actually making your money back. So I help companies get to that profitability with somebody they hire much quicker. I help them formalize the program, make it consistent across the company, and then make it scalable. So it's no longer something where a new employee comes in and you sit them with a manager who just created a PowerPoint slide deck. Then the next group that comes in gets a completely different experience. There's a lot to be said for consistency of message. And then we take that across and we work with marketing and customer service to really formalize a message so everybody is on the same page. Fractional merely means that I do it in a shorter period of time. So I will come in as the chief learning officer. I only need to work with you a couple of hours a week to make this happen. You don't have to bring me on part-time. You don't have to bring me on full-time or sign a long-term contract. Let me do my work in the way that's going to be the most cost efficient for you. So I do it in a fractional period of time for a fraction of the money.
That's a different way of doing it. It's great. Jake, you know what? I find that there is, as you say, spend $20,000 bringing somebody on board, hiring them. By the time it's a long period it can take. So the onboarding is going to be very important to try and get them on and hit the road running and get to be able to bring in sales and so forth to make that
Exactly.
payback time quicker. Now, the thing here is that I presume you're seeing this, I've seen it as well, is that when the onboarding isn't right, when we don't get people underway, the retention is not very good. What are you seeing out there?
It's the exact same thing in the US. When you bring some people on and they don't have a good onboarding experience, you're painting a picture of what the rest of their career is going to look like. Are you investing in them or aren't you? And I often see ads, Dennis, and it really bothers me that says, we pay competitive rates. Okay, then I'll work competitively. You want to pay me the best rates, I'll be the best person that you can get. So I think we really get what we ask for. And part of the whole process of onboarding is not only giving them a good feel of the product and the environment and your demographics, but also a good feel for the company. And it gets them set for the weeks and months to come. And then we just repeat it and we help them grow their skills. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about a sales force, Dennis, is that people just say, you're a salesperson, just sell. And it doesn't work like that. Like any CEO needs to go to classes, CFOs, salespeople need it as well.
It's just the same as leaders. Just lead. No, they need to be developed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leadership is Changing with your host, Denis Gianoutsos. Each week, we and our guests provide information and insights through exploring leading change, inspiring executives and leaders to adapt and lead a bigger game in a fast-moving world.